He died too soon, leaving his 2 young sons behind. Years later, their uncle opened the old garage, and what he revealed changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video. The house had never been large or impressive, yet it was filled with the kind of warmth that could not be measured by size or wealth. Its walls were lined with old photographs, faded but carefully kept, and the kitchen always seemed to carry the faint scent of oil and metal mixed with bread and simple meals. For 2 boys of 10, it was the center of their world. Their father, a quiet man with rough hands and a patient smile, held it all together. He was a mechanic by trade, though to his sons he was more magician than laborer. They watched him return from long days at the workshop with grease under his nails and fatigue in his shoulders, but somehow still find energy to ruffle their hair or help with schoolwork. Life had not been easy for him. Their mother had died when the boys were too young to understand what death really meant. There were only photographs now, a woman with laughing eyes holding 2 infants, images yellowed by time and touched with fingerprints, where the boys had tried to feel what they could not remember. The father never spoke ill of her, nor did he linger on grief. Instead, he built a life of quiet determination, working long hours, keeping the house in modest repair, and making sure his sons felt loved even when money was thin. The garage behind the house was his sanctuary. To the boys, it was a place of mystery and wonder, always closed, always humming with the soft clank of tools when he was home. Sometimes, late at night, they would sneak to their bedroom window and see the thin line of light under the garage door, hear the occasional grind of a drill or the metallic ring of a wrench. When they asked what he was doing in there, he only smiled and said he was working on something important for the future. They imagined engines and bicycles, maybe some secret machine. Whatever it was, it felt like a promise. As the years passed, the father's strength seemed unshakable, but small signs began to show. It started with little things, longer rests after dinner, hands that sometimes trembled when he lifted a heavy object, coughing fits he tried to hide behind a closed door. At first, the boys barely noticed. Children are quick to accept what is familiar. But over time, the changes deepened. He came home more exhausted, often retreating to his room for short naps that stretched into hours. The laughter that once came easily after supper grew quieter, replaced by long silences as he sat staring into some distance only he could see. Still, he worked. The garage door would click shut each evening, and the soft rhythm of his tools would fill the night air. Even when the cough worsened, even when his face turned pale and his shoulders slumped, he disappeared into that space as though it held the last pieces of his strength. The boys learned to tiptoe around it, respecting what they didn't understand. They whispered between themselves about what their father might be building, sometimes imagining fantastic machines or even a small airplane. The thought that he might be racing against time never crossed their minds. The illness advanced with cruel patience. There were days when he could not get out of bed, his breathing shallow, his body shaking with effort just to stand. Yet he forced himself to move, to keep some sense of normal life for his children. He still packed their lunches, still tried to help with homework when his hands weren't trembling too much to hold a pencil. He never once complained. He would look at them with that same quiet love, as if trying to memorize their faces. The boys sensed something was wrong long before anyone told them. Children feel the weight of unspoken truths. They saw the way their father's clothes hung looser, the way his skin lost color, the way his eyes sometimes lingered on them as though searching for courage. But he never sat them down to explain. Perhaps he wanted to spare them the fear, or perhaps he believed he could fight longer than his body would allow. In the evenings, he still disappeared to the garage, sometimes coughing so hard they worried he might collapse. Yet every morning, he returned with a faint smile and the strength to be their dad for another day. As the winter drew near that year, his decline became undeniable. He stopped going to the workshop entirely. Neighbors came by now, and then to check in, offering food or small help. But there was little family presence beyond an occasional visit from his older brother. That man, the boy's uncle, was kind, but distant, living his own life across town, visiting only when he could. The other relatives were almost strangers, their interest long since dulled by distance and quiet disapproval of the father's simple, unglamorous life. The garage grew even more mysterious then. Some nights the boys awoke to the sound of movement long after midnight, the clink of metal, the whir of a small machine. They would peek down the hallway and see the back door standing open, light spilling across the frosted yard as their father worked against time itself. They did not know that he was pouring the last of his strength into something they would not understand until much later. All they knew was that his love for them filled that small shed with light. Eventually, even that work slowed. The illness stole his energy day by day until the garage remained dark and silent. He spent his final weeks mostly in bed, the window beside him cracked to let in the smell of oil and cold air. The boys would sit with him, small hands clutching his larger ones, frightened but trying to be brave. He still managed faint smiles, still reached out to smooth their hair or squeeze their fingers. On his better days, he whispered encouragements, though his voice had grown thin and uneven. No doctors promised hope anymore. It was just time, slipping away quietly. The father faced it with the same quiet dignity that had shaped his whole life. There were no angry outbursts, no dramatic speeches, only patience, love, and a certain determination that his boys would feel secure, even when he was gone. He spent his last lucid hours writing notes, sorting through papers, making small arrangements no one else seemed to care about. He hid them where he believed they would one day be found. He kept the garage locked. The morning he died was cold and pale. The boys woke to the sound of stillness, a kind of silence deeper than any they had known before. Their father lay peacefully, his face softened by the quiet, his hand still warm when they held it. He slipped away without a word, and the world for them changed in an instant. The house, once a fortress of safety, felt impossibly large and hollow. Grief swept in like a tide, confusing and suffocating. In the days that followed, the weight of adult decisions fell on shoulders far too young to carry it. Papers needed signing. Arrangements had to be made. The boys, dazed and frightened, could do little but follow instructions. Relatives appeared only to shake their heads and murmur about expenses. Some questioned why so much should be spent on a man who, in their eyes, had done so little with his life. They whispered about wasted potential, about how foolish he had been to live so modestly. None offered real help. It was their uncle who stepped forward. He arrived quietly, without fanfare, and began to shoulder the burdens no one else wanted. He arranged the funeral, paid the bills, handled the paperwork, and reassured the boys in his gruff, gentle way. They didn't know him well, but in that moment, he became their anchor in a sea of loss. The funeral itself was small. Only a few neighbors came to pay their respects, people who remembered the father as a quiet but kind man who had once fixed their fences or repaired an engine without asking for much in return. No other family members appeared. The boys stood side by side at the graveside, clutching small flowers in trembling hands. The ground smelled of damp earth, and the sky hung heavy with gray clouds. They watched the coffin sink slowly into the soil and felt as though everything good in their lives was being buried with it. Their uncle stood behind them, a silent sentinel, one hand resting on each boy's shoulder. He said nothing, but his presence was solid and reassuring in a way that words could not match. When it was over, and the last handfuls of soil were thrown, the boys returned to the house one last time. It felt foreign now, hollowed out by absence. Their father's slippers still sat by the bed. His tools still hung neatly in the garage. But without him, the space seemed to have lost its soul. They wandered from room to room, touching familiar objects as though trying to hold on to him through things. Their uncle quietly packed the few essentials they would need. He did not rush them. He let them grieve in silence, understanding better than anyone that some losses cannot be softened by talk. That night, they left the only home they had ever known and went to live with him. His house was smaller, humbler still, but alive with warmth that he tried awkwardly to offer. He was not their father, and never tried to be, but he promised himself he would not let them be lost. The garage they left behind remained locked, untouched, its secret sealed in dust and darkness. For the boys, the pain was raw and overwhelming, but there was also a faint thread of security now. They had someone. They were not entirely alone. What they could not know was that the story their father had begun was far from finished. Somewhere in that locked garage, under the weight of silence and grief, waited the final gift he had prepared for them. They were still too young to understand. The time would come, but not yet. The days that followed their father's death passed in a blur of confusion and exhaustion. The two boys, still small enough that their feet barely touched the floor when they sat at the kitchen table, woke each morning hoping for a sound that would tell them everything had been a bad dream. But the house was silent now, in a way it had never been before. It was the kind of silence that seeped into the walls and settled in the corners, heavy and unyielding. The chair where their father used to drink his morning coffee remained empty. His work jacket still hung on the hook by the door, and the smell of motor oil that usually drifted from the garage seemed to have grown faint and distant. Grief moved slowly but powerfully, like a tide creeping over every part of their small world. The practicalities of death arrived swiftly, cold and indifferent to their pain. Strangers from the funeral home came to speak in quiet, measured voices about costs, paperwork, and schedules. Words like certificate, plot, and embalming floated past the boys as though they belonged to another language. They understood only one thing. All of this was expensive, and no one seemed eager to help. Their father had lived a modest life, leaving behind little more than the house, the tools, and the locked garage. There was no savings to cover the price of dying. Relatives began to appear, not out of love or grief, but out of obligation and curiosity. An aunt they barely remembered arrived one afternoon and stood in the doorway looking around as if appraising what could be sold. She clucked her tongue, said how sad it all was, and quietly advised that they keep things simple, that a man like their father didn't need much of a send-off. Another cousin called to ask who would be paying, her tone more businesslike than sorrowful. Some sent brief messages filled with empty condolences, but offered no help, no presence. In whispered conversations, the boys overheard words that cut deeply, even if they didn't understand all of them. He never made much of himself, lived too small. Don't throw money away on funerals. They might have been left adrift entirely, if not for the man who arrived one gray morning and changed the course of their lives. He came without ceremony, driving an old pickup that rattled over the cracked driveway. When he stepped out, the boys recognized him instantly, despite having seen him only a few times before. It was their uncle, their father's older brother. Taller, heavier set, with a face lined by years of work and worry, he carried himself with a quiet steadiness that was unfamiliar but somehow comforting. He hugged them both without hesitation, a strong, brief embrace that said more than any words could have managed. He didn't ask if they needed him. He simply took charge. Within hours, he was on the phone with the funeral home, sorting through contracts and bills. He spoke firmly but without aggression, negotiating costs, insisting on respect for his brother, even when money was tight. The boys watched from the doorway as this man, this almost stranger, fought for their father's dignity in a way no one else seemed willing to do. When others suggested cutting corners, he refused. When someone implied their father hadn't earned anything better, he went silent in a way that made the room colder, then said, "He was my brother." And that was the end of the discussion. The funeral itself came under a low, slate-colored sky. Rain threatened, but never fully fell, leaving the air damp and heavy. Only a handful of people gathered, a neighbor who had once shared tools, a man from the workshop who owed their father a favor, an elderly couple who had lived down the street for decades. Family was almost entirely absent. The few who came stood off to the side, whispering about costs or checking their watches. But the uncle stood solidly beside the boys, one hand on each of their small shoulders, anchoring them as the casket was lowered into the waiting earth. He had paid for the simple but dignified coffin, the modest flowers, and the burial plot no one else wanted to claim. For the boys, the service was both surreal and painfully real. They watched the wooden box disappear beneath the ground, the sound of dirt striking the lid ringing in their ears like thunder. They clutched their small bouquets, unable to stop their tears. Everything about the moment felt wrong, not just the loss, but the absence of the people who should have cared. Their father had lived a quiet, hard-working life, and now, even in death, the world seemed eager to dismiss him. When the last handful of soil was thrown, and the mourners began to drift away, the uncle didn't rush them. He stayed, silent and unmoving, letting the boys stand as long as they needed, their shoes sinking into the damp grass. At last, when their tears had slowed and exhaustion began to weigh them down, he guided them gently back to his truck. The ride away from the cemetery was quiet except for the low hum of the engine. Neither boy spoke, but both felt the steady presence of the man who now seemed the only solid thing left in their collapsing world. Back at their father's house, the uncle moved through the rooms with deliberate care. He didn't touch anything he didn't have to, respecting the small sanctuary their father had built. The boys trailed behind him, numb and watchful, as he gathered the essentials: clothes, school books, the few keepsakes that could fit in bags. He did not comment on the photographs, the worn furniture, or the locked door of the garage. He paused there for a moment, hand brushing the handle, and then moved on. The boys noticed, but were too drained to ask. Some part of them sensed that whatever lay behind that door was not meant for now. That night, the three of them left the house behind. As the truck pulled away, the boys watched their home shrink in the side mirror. The sagging porch, the bare winter trees, the dark garage standing sentinel in the yard. It felt like leaving their father behind a second time, but they had no choice. The uncle drove steadily, saying little, but his presence filled the cab with a kind of muted safety. When they finally reached his house, a modest single-story place with peeling paint and the smell of wood smoke, the boys were too tired to feel much of anything. Life there was different, but not unkind. Their uncle lived simply, working long hours with his hands just as their father had, though in construction rather than mechanics. The house was small but warm, its kitchen cluttered but inviting. He cleared a room for the boys, bringing in 2 mismatched beds and a dresser that smelled faintly of sawdust. There were no grand speeches or false promises. Instead, he showed his care in quiet, practical ways, making sure they ate, helping with school forms, leaving the porch light on when he came home late from work. Grief did not vanish, but in this new home, it softened enough for the boys to breathe again. They still dreamed of their father at night, still woke sometimes, expecting to hear his voice. But the steady rhythm of their uncle's household gave them a fragile sense of security. Over time, trust grew. He became not a replacement for their father, but a new kind of anchorless warmth, perhaps, but reliable in a world that had so suddenly betrayed them. Years began to pass. The boys grew taller, their faces lengthening into young men's features. School consumed their days, chores and helping their uncle filled evenings. They learned to fix small things around the house, to cook simple meals, to stand on their own feet in ways their father would have been proud of. Yet a quiet longing remained, a question that grew stronger with age. Who had their father truly been beyond the small life they remembered? What had he spent all those nights building in the garage, and why had he kept it secret? Their uncle did not speak much about his brother. He would share a story now and then, a memory of their childhood, a glimpse of the man behind the grease and exhaustion, but he seemed to hold something back. He never mentioned the garage. He never brought up what had been left behind. The boys noticed but did not press. Something in his silence suggested it was not yet time. Still, he returned to that house more than once. On quiet weekends, while the boys were busy with school or chores, he would drive there alone. He would check the locks, make sure the roof was holding, clear snow from the porch. And always he would stand for a long moment outside the garage, looking at the door as though it were keeping watch with him. Then he would leave, locking it behind him each time. He was protecting something of that the boys were sure, even if they didn't know what. By the time they reached their teenage years, the mystery had become a steady undercurrent in their lives. They were grateful to their uncle, loved him in their own quiet way, but the longing for their father's untold story never faded. They wanted to know what he had been working on, what dreams he had harbored beyond the simple life everyone assumed he lived. And though they didn't realize it yet, their uncle was waiting too. Waiting for the day when they would be old enough, steady enough, to face the truth he had guarded for them. The garage remained locked, silent and untouched through the seasons. Snow gathered on its roof in winter, vines crept along its walls in summer, and each year it grew more like a relic of another life. But inside, undisturbed, the last pieces of their father's love waited patiently. The time to discover them was drawing nearer, though none of them could yet say when the door would finally open. Time moved quietly in their uncle's house, steady and unremarkable, and yet beneath the surface, something was always waiting. The two boys grew from children into lanky teenagers, their faces losing the softness of youth and taking on the edges of young men. School and small jobs filled their days. On weekends, they sometimes worked alongside their uncle, hauling lumber, sweeping out job sites, or helping fix whatever needed fixing around the modest home. They became capable and independent in ways their father would have admired. But no matter how busy life grew, the absence of their father was a silent undertone that never faded. They carried it quietly, each in his own way. As they grew older, curiosity sharpened into something more deliberate. They began to talk more openly about the man they had lost. At first it was small things, questions about how he had learned to fix engines, memories of his laugh, of how he could make broken things whole again. But gradually, their conversations turned toward the mystery that had lingered since childhood. The garage. They remembered the long nights when a single strip of light glowed beneath the door, the sounds of tools clinking and engines whispering under his hands. They remembered how he always told them it was something for the future, but never explained. The secrecy had been comforting once, a father's playful secret, but now it felt like an unfinished story that belonged to them. Their uncle listened more often than he spoke when they asked about their father. He would nod, sometimes smile faintly, and tell a brief story from their shared youth, how their father had once built a go-kart from scrap wood and lawnmower parts, how he could fix almost anything with patience and ingenuity. But he avoided the garage. Whenever they asked what their father had worked on in those long nights, the uncle's face grew thoughtful and quiet. That was his space, he would say softly, and change the subject. It was not a refusal born of secrecy for its own sake. It was the quiet patience of someone who believed in the rightness of timing. By the time the boys reached 15, they had begun to dream about driving. Cars fascinated them, the way they had fascinated their father, though neither had learned more than the basics. They watched friends at school brag about rides in new trucks or shiny sedans, but for them, cars were tied to something deeper. The smell of oil that had clung to their father's clothes, the gleam in his eyes when he worked in silence. Sometimes at night, lying awake in their shared room, they whispered about what might have been hidden behind that locked door. One imagined an old race car waiting to roar again. The other thought perhaps it was just spare parts, their father's unfinished dreams lost to time. But neither could let go of the mystery. Their uncle noticed. He always noticed more than he said. One chilly autumn evening, after dinner, when the air outside smelled of damp leaves and wood smoke, he sat in his worn armchair, watching them with an expression they couldn't read. They were taller now, nearly grown, their shoulders broader, their hands roughened by work. He saw in them the echoes of his brother, the set of the jaw, the quiet endurance, the glimmers of curiosity that would not die. He understood then what he had been waiting for. The boys were no longer fragile children stumbling through grief. They were strong enough now to face their father's legacy, to understand what had been left for them. He did not announce his decision with a speech. He simply said, almost casually, that they should go back to the old house that weekend. "There's something you need to see," he told them. The simplicity of the words carried weight neither could mistake. They exchanged a glance but did not press him. Some instinct told them that the time they had longed for had finally arrived. Saturday dawned gray and cool, a sky the color of pewter stretching over the quiet streets as the uncle's truck rumbled out of town. The ride was mostly silent, but it was not an awkward silence. It was the kind that grows when something important hovers just beyond reach. The boys stared out at fields lined with drying corn stalks and trees already losing their leaves, hearts beating faster with each mile. When they turned onto the cracked driveway of their childhood home, memories rushed back in a flood. The house looked smaller than they remembered, more weathered. Weeds sprouted through the walkway, and the windows were dusty and dim. Yet despite its tired appearance, it was alive with ghosts. They stepped out slowly, the crunch of gravel under their shoes echoing louder than seemed possible. The air smelled of damp wood, and faintly of the oil that had once soaked into the earth around the garage. The house stood silent, patient, like a sleeping animal waiting to be acknowledged. Inside, time had stood still. Furniture sat where it had been the day they left. Their father's chair still faced the window, empty but familiar. Dust lay across surfaces like a soft veil, but nothing had been disturbed. Each step stirred memories. Bedtime stories read in the living room, breakfasts at the small table, the quiet hum of their father's work in the night. Their uncle let them take it in without hurry. He moved through the house with the same deliberate care he had shown years ago, pausing now and then but saying little. He seemed to know that this was not a moment to fill with words. At last, he led them toward the back door, the one that opened to the small yard where the garage stood. The boys followed, hearts pounding so hard they felt it in their throats. The garage looked just as it had the day they'd driven away. Paint flaking from its door, roof sagging slightly with age, vines creeping up the sides. The padlock on the handle was rusted, but intact. For a long moment they stood there, staring. The boys exchanged a glance. Their uncle studied the door, as though remembering every visit he'd made alone. Then, with a slow breath, he reached into his jacket pocket and drew out a ring of keys. The sound of metal against metal was startling in the still yard. He sorted through the keys, found one worn smooth with years, and slid it into the lock. There was resistance at first, the kind that comes from long neglect, but with a final groan, the mechanism gave way. The uncle removed the lock and pulled the door open. The first breath of air from inside was cool and heavy with the scent of oil, metal, and time. Dust floated in the shaft of light that cut across the concrete floor. The boys hesitated on the threshold, overwhelmed by the sudden weight of memory and mystery colliding. Then, step by step, they crossed into their father's world. It was as though time had stopped the night he died. Tools lay neatly on benches, some mid-use, as if waiting for a hand to return. Shelves sagged under the weight of jars filled with bolts and screws, labeled in his precise, slanted handwriting. Against one wall stood a workbench, cluttered with notebooks, yellowed sketches, and stacks of parts whose names they didn't know. The air was thick with dust, but also something warmer, an echo of their father's presence. They could almost imagine him turning toward them with a grin smudged by grease, telling them to hand him a wrench. Their eyes, however, were drawn almost immediately to the far side of the garage. There, looming in the dim light, were two enormous shapes hidden beneath heavy tarps. The outlines were unmistakable even under years of dust. Long hoods, curved roofs, the stance of machines built to move. The boys froze, hearts thundering. Every childhood suspicion, every night of wondering what their father had built, now stood before them waiting to be revealed. The uncle said nothing. He simply nodded toward the shapes and stepped back, as if to give them the honor. With trembling hands, the older twin approached the first tarp. The fabric clung stubbornly, stiff from years of disuse, but with a sharp pull it slid free, unleashing a cloud of dust that sparkled in the light. What stood beneath made both boys gasp. It was a car, not some rusted wreck, but a sleek, beautiful machine, even in its unfinished state. Its body was bare metal in some places, primer gray in others, the lines bold and purposeful. The design was striking, a mixture of classic sports car curves and something their father had clearly adapted himself. The seats were missing, the engine bay half empty, wires and hoses waiting for completion. But even in its incomplete form, it was extraordinary. It was not a hobbyist's toy. It was the work of a man who had dreamed deeply and dared to build. The younger brother's eyes filled with tears as he reached out a shaking hand to touch the cold metal. It was real. Their father had been building this for them, not as a mechanic tinkering for fun, but as a father leaving behind something that spoke louder than words. They turned to the second tarp together. This one came away easier, sliding to the floor with a heavy whisper. Beneath it stood another car, slightly different but equally stunning. Lower to the ground, sharper in design, its frame already painted a deep, faded blue. It too was unfinished doors not yet hung, engine missing key parts, but its intent was clear. 2 cars, 2 sons. Their father had poured his final strength into creating a future for each of them. For a long time they simply stood there, overwhelmed. The uncle moved quietly among the workbenches, giving them space, but watching with eyes that shone with something between pride and sorrow. He had known what waited here all along. He had kept it safe, locked away from greedy hands and careless hearts, until the day his brother's sons were ready to inherit not just objects, but a legacy. The boys walked slowly around the cars, touching the frames, peering into unfinished interiors. Everywhere they looked, they found pieces of their father. His careful handwriting on masking tape labels, the neat arrangement of bolts and parts, the half-finished wiring tucked away with patience. They noticed stacks of notebooks on the workbench and opened one to find drawings and calculations, engines carefully mapped out, parts listed, notes about speed and safety. It was like discovering a conversation they had been waiting to have for years. Through these pages he was speaking to them, telling them who he was, a dreamer, a craftsman, a man who believed enough in his sons to build something extraordinary for them, even as his body failed. Tears came freely then, quiet and unstoppable. They cried for the father they had lost, for the nights they hadn't understood, for the love that had worked itself into bolts and blueprints while they slept. They cried for all the times they had wished for a sign that he was still with them, and now here it was, tangible and powerful. The cars were not just machines. They were proof that he had seen their future, even when he knew he might not be part of it. The uncle finally stepped forward, placing a heavy, steadying hand on each of their shoulders. He didn't need to say much. His silence was full of meaning. This was your father. This is what he wanted for you. He had guarded it, not for himself, but because he believed someday you would be ready. Now you are. The garage, once a place of mystery, had transformed into a cathedral of memory. It was no longer just a locked shed behind an old house. It was the truest portrait of their father's heart, a place where love had taken the shape of engines and steel, where hope had been built, bolt by bolt, in the quiet of the night. As dusk fell outside and the light softened across the metal frames, the boys stood together with their uncle and felt something shift inside them. Grief, long a heavy weight, began to change. It didn't leave, but it found a new shape, one filled with pride, determination, and a sense of purpose. They left the garage reluctantly when darkness finally swallowed the yard. The uncle locked the door again, but this time the sound of the latch was different. It was not a closing against them. It was a promise that they could return. The boys walked back to the truck, changed, hearts swollen with sorrow and strength all at once. For years they had lived with the ache of not knowing who their father had truly been. Now, they understood more than they ever dreamed. He had not left them empty. He had left them a mission, a love expressed not in words, but in creation. As the truck rolled down the dark road toward the uncle's house, the boys stared out the window, silent but awake in a way they had not been since the day they buried their father. The shapes of the cars stayed vivid in their minds, the unfinished steel gleaming under dust, waiting. They understood now why their uncle had waited, why he had guarded that place so fiercely. Some gifts need time to be recognized, and now that they had seen, nothing in their lives would ever be the same again. The drive back from their childhood home was quiet, but not in the way grief had once made silence heavy. It was a different kind of quiet, now charged, alive, full of unspoken understanding. The boys sat side by side in the cab of their uncle's old truck, staring out at the night-lit fields and the faint glow of distant farmhouses. Their minds were still in that garage, where dust hung in the light, and two unfinished machines waited like sleeping animals. They felt as though they had just met their father again, not as a fading memory, but as a man with a vision he had fought to leave behind. For years they had mourned him as someone ordinary, someone whose life had ended too soon and left little more than love and struggle. Now they knew he had dreamed bigger than anyone realized. The revelation stirred something powerful and new, a desire to honor him, not with words or rituals, but with action. Their uncle sensed the change without needing to be told. When they pulled into his driveway and stepped out beneath the cold stars, he didn't ask what they were thinking. He knew. Instead, he clapped each of them once on the back and simply said, "We'll talk tomorrow." Then he left them to sit on the porch together, staring into the darkness, unable to sleep for the weight of what they had seen. They didn't need to speak much. They both felt the same pull. The garage wasn't just a relic. It was a challenge, a call left for them to answer. The next morning, the house was filled with the smell of coffee and sawdust. Their uncle sat at the kitchen table going through a stack of bills, his glasses perched low on his nose. When the boys came in, still heavy-eyed but alert, he looked up and studied them for a long moment. Then, in his slow and deliberate way, he asked what they thought. It wasn't a question about the past. It was about the future. They didn't hesitate. Each of them said, almost at the same time, that they wanted to finish what their father had started. The man nodded once, a simple, solemn gesture that seemed to hold both pride and concern. He reminded them that it would not be easy. The cars were complex, unfinished, and had sat untouched for years. Tools would break, parts would be expensive, knowledge would need to be learned from scratch. But he didn't discourage them. He only made sure they understood the weight of what they were choosing. When they both answered with the same unwavering seriousness he had seen in his brother's eyes years before, he said quietly, "Then we'll find a way." That decision marked the beginning of a new life for the brothers. School still demanded their time. Chores still needed doing. But now every spare moment turned toward the legacy waiting in that dusty garage. Their uncle drove them back the following weekend, this time with purpose. The lock came off, the doors swung wide, and daylight poured over the sleeping cars, as though blessing the work to come. The boys stood there a long time, feeling the enormity of the task, but their fear was tempered by determination. They began with small, careful steps, sweeping the floor, organizing their father's notes, cataloging tools, and trying to make sense of his meticulous sketches. At first, frustration came often. The notebooks were detailed but dense with technical terms they didn't understand. The engines, beautiful but incomplete, seemed to mock their inexperience. Bolts seized with rust, wires had frayed, and some parts had vanished or corroded with time. More than once they left the garage at night with sore hands and aching hearts, wondering if they had taken on more than they could handle. Yet each time doubt crept in. The memory of their father's quiet perseverance steadied them. He had built these machines while sick, exhausted, and alone. They were healthy, strong, and had each other and their uncle. Their uncle became their greatest ally. Though he wasn't an expert mechanic, decades of working with his hands gave him practical wisdom. He showed them how to free a frozen bolt without breaking it, how to use leverage instead of brute force, how to keep a workspace safe and efficient. When problems exceeded his knowledge, he helped them find solutions. He called in favors from old friends, tracked down retired mechanics who still knew how to work with older engines, and even taught the boys how to navigate junkyards and online forums for rare parts. He never took over the project. He guided, encouraged, and stood back enough for them to learn through trial and error. Bit by bit, the garage began to change. The smell of fresh oil returned. The cold, silent air filled with the sound of wrenches clanking and drills humming. The boys discovered the rhythm of hard work, the patience to try, fail, and try again until a stubborn piece finally fit. They learned to read their father's notes like another language, understanding how each line of calculation told a story about safety, balance, and speed. Every page felt like a quiet conversation with the man they had lost. Sometimes they laughed at his scribbled side comments, small jokes or reminders to himself. Sometimes they stopped working altogether, overcome by emotion when they realized how carefully he had planned each step with them in mind. Weeks turned to months. The seasons outside shifted, winter frost melting into spring mud, summer heat pressing against the garage's thin walls. Inside, progress grew tangible. The first car's body was stripped, sanded, and primed anew. The frame gleamed with fresh paint, the color of deep charcoal, chosen because they thought their father would have liked its understated strength. They rebuilt the suspension piece by piece, cleaned the wiring, replaced worn hoses. The engine was a puzzle of complexity, but with help from their uncle's contacts and many long nights of study, they managed to rebuild it, bolt by bolt, until it stood proud and whole. The second car proved even more challenging. Its design was sleeker, more ambitious, and much less complete. They argued sometimes, two brothers with different ideas about how to proceed, but those arguments ended as quickly as they began. The work itself demanded unity. Slowly, stubbornly, they made progress. They learned to weld with precision, to shape panels, to tune parts until they sang together. Along the way, they became not just brothers, but partners, each compensating for the other's weaknesses, each sharing in small victories and setbacks alike. Through it all, their uncle remained a constant presence. He never let them quit, though he also never pushed beyond what was healthy. When money grew tight, he found ways to help, taking extra jobs, selling old tools he no longer used, sometimes slipping bills into their hands with the excuse of gas money, when he knew it would go toward a rare part instead. On late nights when frustration had them near tears, he would appear quietly with sandwiches or coffee, saying nothing but making sure they ate and rested before trying again. In those moments, they felt the deep, unspoken bond that had formed, a man honoring his brother by raising the boys he left behind, and two sons slowly becoming the men their father had hoped they would be. As the years of work stretched on, the project became more than just finishing cars. It became a journey of healing. The garage, once a tomb of grief, transformed into a place of light and purpose. They talked there about life, about their father, about who they wanted to be. They learned patience, resilience, and the satisfaction of creation. Every finished section of engine or polished panel felt like reclaiming a piece of their father's love from the silence that had once swallowed it. The day the first car roared to life was like no other. It was a late summer afternoon, sunlight pouring through the open garage door, dust motes dancing in the warm air. The older brother sat behind the wheel, hands trembling on the key, while the younger stood ready with a camera half joking, but mostly wanting to preserve the moment. Their uncle leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, but eyes bright. When the engine turned over, and then caught with a deep, throaty growl, the sound filled the space and their hearts at once. They shouted, laughed, cried, overwhelmed by joy and relief. It was as though their father had spoken through the machine, telling them he was proud, telling them they had done what he could not finish. Later, when the excitement settled into a quiet awe, they took turns sitting in the driver's seat, touching the wheel, feeling the hum of the engine beneath their feet. It wasn't perfect. There would still be tuning, adjustments, finishing touches. But it lived. They had brought it to life. In that moment, the years of loss felt different. The grief was still there, but now it was joined by triumph, love, and a deep sense of connection that death had failed to erase. The second car would take more time, but they were no longer intimidated. They knew now that they could build, that they could carry forward what their father had started. More importantly, they knew they were not alone. They had each other and the uncle who had stepped into a role he had never asked for, but embraced fully. Together, they had turned sorrow into strength and absence into legacy. When the sun set that evening, the three of them sat outside the garage on the old porch steps, watching the light fade. The first car sat just inside the doorway, gleaming faintly in the dusk. It was more than metal and paint. It was a bridge across years of silence and pain. One of the brothers leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees, and whispered that they would finish the second car no matter how long it took. The other nodded, eyes still shining from tears he hadn't bothered to hide. Their uncle didn't speak. He just reached out and rested a hand on each of their shoulders, the same way he had at their father's grave, steady and sure. The night settled softly around them, full of crickets and the faint smell of oil. The garage door stood open, no longer a barrier, but a welcome. Inside, the unfinished second car waited, and beyond it, the stacks of their father's notes promised years of work yet to come. But there was no fear in the waiting now. There was purpose, and purpose had become their inheritance. They had once been two boys lost to grief, taken in by a quiet man who saved them from being forgotten. Now they were young men shaped by love, resilience, and the labor of their own hands. They understood their father in ways they never had as children. He had not been a man of speeches or grand gestures. He had been a builder, patient and persistent, believing in the future even as his own time ran out. He had built for them. And now, they would build for him. When they finally rose to go inside, locking up for the night, the older twin paused and looked back at the glowing shape of the car in the dim light. He smiled, not the smile of a child mourning, but of a son who had found his place in the long, quiet line of his family. Tomorrow they would return to work on the second car. Tomorrow they would continue what had begun years ago in the hands of a dying man who refused to stop loving his children. And somewhere, in the steady hum of engines and the scent of oil on their clothes, they felt certain their father was still with them. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more powerful stories you won't want to miss. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.